Hello there, welcome to my channel. On this particular episode, we're going to focus on that classic question, the question that comes up on Reddit posts on my channel or in conversations I've had with people outside of the internet, which is basically why use an e-ink device when you have the iPad and what it can do. So we're going to explore that, particularly in light of the most recent iPads coming out here in 2025. And we'll see how well does the iPad stack up against e-ink devices, and to what degree does it still make sense, if any, to use an e-ink device as your main note-taking device. So that's what we're hoping to explore here. Now, a quick word about the iPad comparison itself. Here I have the latest 2025 regular iPad. This is the base model. It's using, I think, the A17 chip, which is a mobile chip that originally appeared in the iPhone a few years ago. Now, the reason why I'm focusing on this particular model is because it's clearly the most price competitive as it relates to other popular e-ink devices that you can get. So this particular model, which included both the device as well as the Apple Pencil, costs $428 before any type of shipping or tax. That's comparable to a lot of the more popular e-ink devices today, the good ones, that can range from as low as $380 to kind of the mid $500. So all of the best e-ink devices, in my opinion, today are in that range. And this is the only version of the iPad that kind of fits with that in that range as well. In fact, if you go up to the next model, you run into the iPad Air, and there's a $250 gap between base models. So you're moving, close to $700 just to go up to that next model. So there's no price competitiveness on the iPad Air, in my opinion. And then even on the base iPad, if you start adding additional storage and other things, that could start to actually hinder its price competitiveness as well. But in my opinion, as it relates to note-taking alone, the base model is actually quite good. I've seen a lot of reviews about the latest iPads that have come out, and basically what you see is this bifurcation of recommendations where some people say the base model is the one to get or the iPad Air is the one to get. I think people discount the mini because the size of the screen is too small, so people want the larger screen size, at least the 10-inch screen size, if not bigger. And the Pro, which is really more a competitor to the Mac Air than it is to the other iPads, is clearly in its own kind of world, if you will. So for most people, you're considering an iPad, you're looking at the base model or the Air model. Now, I'm going to summarize, because this isn't the focus of the video, but generally speaking, I think the arguments for each are as follows. The iPad Air, the A17 base model, is the best value, and the iPad Air is the best device. So in other words, all the features and the chip and so on of the iPad Air makes it a superior device, but you pay a lot of money for that. And a lot of those differences are incremental. Not all of them, but a lot of them. So while the Air is certainly the better device, that value that you get out of it is nothing like what you get out of the base model. To me, that's usually what people focus on when they're looking at these two devices. Also, if you're focused more on more computer-like tasks, then people, I think, tend to favor the iPad Air. And if you're focused more on, a consumption device, or as with this video, kind of the basic note-taking and things like that, then they go toward the base model. Plenty of videos out there, plenty of reviews on various tech sites about that. But I think that's kind of what that boils down to here in 2025. So again, we're going to focus now on the base model. And in terms of kind of testing its note-taking ability, we're also going to focus on Apple's integrated or native note-taking application, which is just called Notes. Of course, you can run all sorts of apps on the device. For example, you can run OneNote from Microsoft, and there's other note-taking apps as well. But I'm just going to focus on Apple's to make that contrast with what it can do versus what E-Ink can do. So let's go ahead and do kind of a quick overview of what is available in the Apple's Notes app. This is not a comprehensive overview of features. It is covering most of the features, but there's all sorts of little tips and tricks that can run on the background, which we're not going to show off. So it's not a comprehensive overview, but I think you will get a good feel for what Apple Notes is all about as we go over it. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. Okay, let's go ahead and turn on the iPad. I'm going to press the power button up here, get it out of lock mode, and here we are. And this is the Apple Notes application. I'm using the dark theme, so that's why it's black with the yellow top. We'll go ahead and click on that. And let's just quickly walk through what's available in this application. So first off, we do have a list of notes in folders and files here on the side panel. And you can actually click this and you can see the folder structure here. And it's also here that you can see if there were tags, you could see those tags here and can filter on the files based on those tags. I don't have any tags, so that's not the case here. Here we've come back to the application, and if we just go across and look at the different aspects, and I'm going to go ahead and click on this button right here. So now you have the ability to put kind of bullets. So we use the on-screen keyboard, and you can see the bullets right there in yellow. I can change the formatting, so you can see there's a number of presets here. Also just general formatting, general text color, and what have you. You can also create a table, so it defaults to a 2x2 grid. You can go ahead and, oops, we're a little bit ahead of ourselves. You can attach, so you can use the camera to scan text, scan a document, just take a photo, record audio, or attach a file. So you do have attachment options here. We can export. There's a number of ways to export, but even without clicking on the export functionality, this will automatically sync to iCloud. So if I went to my Mac, after having made some changes here, and as long as it's on Wi-Fi, those changes would automatically be reflected on the Mac. So I don't have to use these export options, but there are a number of options available, including sharing with various applications and so on. You do have some pen styles. So here's your pen tray down here. This pen style here, the one with the letter, basically converts your writing to text. So let's look at an example of that. So it converts that to text and does cursive as well. So that's what this does. This is a classic pen style. You can use any of these preset colors, or you can go ahead and, oops, let's bring that back down here. Or you can click on this item to pick any color that you like. And let me go ahead and show what that's like. Here's a finer point, like so. You certainly have a highlighter, an eraser. This is a selection tool and a ruler that you can move around like so. So kind of a nice little feature there. Take that off. So pretty straightforward. If I click on this ellipsis over here, I can automatically minimize it so you don't see it on the screen. You can draw with a finger. Auto refine handwriting is on, so let's take a look at that. So you'll notice that the handwriting will change and it'll be a little bit neater when it's done. So you see a little bit of a conversion there. Okay. In addition to that, of course, you do have the on-screen keyboard, so you can type in text and you can use the keyboard folio attachment for that as well. If we click on this ellipsis here, there's another place where you can scan documents. It's the same as what we saw under the attachment. You can pin the file. So in other words, if we go back over here, you'll notice that you have pinned files here, and then you have your other files. So you can create your own pins of notes. You can lock it if you like. You can find a note, and this will actually include searching on script. So you can see I just did it there, but I'll retype it in. It can recognize handwriting. So that doesn't work across notebooks, but it does work within a notebook. You can obviously move the note to different folders. They do math results, so let's go ahead and take a look at that. That's kind of an interesting feature. So let's get back into the pen. There we go. Well, again, you can change how thick they are and how opaque the writing is. And see, it does little math things like that. You can also just look at your most recent notes. Lines and grids are what basically this can do. Would be templates in Eink devices, but there's only a small selection you can see here, either lines or grids. We'll go with lines. You can change the attachment view, whether it's small or large. You can go from a light background. So here I was on a black and white background before, and now we're on the light background. And then you can have a little bit of customization of the toolbar. In addition to that, you want to create a new note. You can create it right there with that icon. So this is basically how the notes works. It's a continuous page, so I can keep scrolling down. There's no left or right, there's just up or down, and as far as I know, it goes on indefinitely. And so on. So that's pretty much it. It's a pretty straightforward, but still very powerful note-taking application that's native to pretty much all Apple devices. One of the things that you can do with the iPad to kind of help with the writing experience is you can add a film. And I've done that here. You might be able to see the air bubbles there. That's one of the frustrations of applying your own film. Although if I probably had the opportunity to do it a third or fourth time, I think I could probably finally nail it. Nevertheless, I just want to make the observation that while putting a film on does help definitely give it more of a rough textured feel, and it does add a little bit to the sound, there is a problem with how you interact with the device that is kind of overwhelms the benefits you get from the film. And I just wanted to kind of demonstrate that. So let's go ahead and go into a note, and I'll just do a sound demonstration of what I'm talking about. So I'm in a note right now, and I'm going to go ahead and just start writing onto the note, and I'm not going to lift the pen. I'm going to put it right next to my microphone and just listen to the soft but scratchy sound of the film. So hopefully that came up in the mic. But what you hear is basically kind of a nice little scratchiness to it. But that's not how I naturally write. I lift my pen or stylus in between words, or obviously that's if I'm doing script, and if I'm doing regular print, I'm doing it with every letter. And that's a very different experience. Let's kind of get a sense of what that sounds like. So because I'm lifting the stylus and then reconnecting with it, I'm basically tapping on the screen as I'm writing. And that tap is very loud. And so you can still hear some of the scratchiness, but it's kind of overwhelmed by the tapping. So I guess my point here is that you can add films that do help give the device more of a paper feel and sound, but that gets kind of drowned out by the tapping, which the film can't address. Now, this is one of those areas where the iPad Air does it a little bit better. You still get tapping with the screen, but the tapping is not quite as harsh as it is with this version of the iPad. And that helps make it a little less of an issue. But there's no question that the top audio sensation you get is that tapping of the screen with the iPad. And that's something you don't experience nearly in the same manner with e-ink devices. So having kind of gone over the Notes app on Apple, I want to make what I think are the top 5 reasons why you would want to focus on using the iPad versus an e-ink device. And these are going to be in no particular order, but let's go ahead and start with portability of notes. So because you're on the iCloud services and you've got this integration with other Apple devices, there's a lot of portability that's available with Apple and its native Notes app. If I make notes on the iPad, all those notes could be available on whatever Apple devices I have. So that's really good. You could argue the same thing would be true if you're using OneNote, which is available on the iPad as well under the Microsoft ecosystem. Of course, you have OneNote on some e-ink devices as well. And so there is some of that portability that's available on those devices, but e-ink native devices generally aren't nearly as integrated with other devices as they are with the iPad. You do see in many cases where you can go into cloud services via a web browser. So there is some portability of notes, but Apple clearly takes that to a whole different level. So that's one major advantage, I think, for the iPad. In addition to that, obviously the color of the screen is something that e-ink has a really hard time replicating. Many e-ink screens are black and white. Some do have color, but there's real limitations to that color. You don't have those limitations at all, even on this base model of the iPad. So you have a lot more room to work with different colors. And that has some note-taking applicability. Obviously, that's even more prominent if you're doing sketching and drawing and that sort of thing. But nevertheless, a huge plus for the Apple iPad is its ability to produce a wide range of colors and very vibrant at that. The third thing I'll point to is that you can search on handwriting. And we saw a little bit of that example in the demo that we just did. And that makes it a lot more powerful to be able to refer to some of your notes. Now, some e-ink devices do have that capability, but it's not nearly as elegant. With Boox, for example, if you have a lot of different notes on a device and you're searching on handwriting, which is something you can do, it really is kind of bogged down. Supernote does a better version of that, but it's still a little bit slower than what you have with Apple. So Apple basically has, I think, the fastest and most efficient search on handwriting feature of all of these devices. The other thing I'll point out with the Apple Notes is the ability to collaborate. So, you might have seen that. I quickly went through the menu. I didn't comment on it, but there was an option under the share button to start collaborating on notes. So much like, say, a Google Docs, as long as someone's on the Apple ecosystem, you can have them come in and collaborate on notes as well. And that's a very rare feature. You don't see that in the native note-taking apps of these e-ink devices. The last thing I would say in favor of the Apple iPad is it's just the best overall device by a long shot. So this is the one device to rule them all argument, which is that not only can you do your note-taking, but you now have capacity to do, other content, things like watching Netflix, of reading articles, of reading books, of doing some productivity applications, playing games. I mean, there's just all sorts of things that you can do on an Apple iPad. And there's no question, if you were looking for one device that did all those things or a combination of those things, you most always would go toward an iPad as opposed to an e-ink device. Apple has the better overall device, and I think that's pretty clear, hands down. So those are the 5 reasons, the 5 predominant reasons that I think Apple is basically the superior note-taking device. Given all the advantages that the iPad has, what can e-ink do in defense of itself? What are the arguments for e-ink devices as opposed to the iPad? And I'm going to give you 5 things here as well. And the first thing is battery life. E-ink devices have significantly better battery life than the iPad. So I'll give you one example of what I mean. I use an e-ink device for note-taking at work. I charge it on the weekend, usually Friday night, power it down, and then Monday I power it up and leave it open on a standby mode. My device now is basically sitting on my desk, and at any point I can pick up the stylus and start writing on it. And it's in this mode until the end of the day when I close it, put it to sleep, until the next day where I open it up, and I repeat that process until Friday. So 5 days a week for roughly 9 to 10 hours, the device is sitting there on standby mode where I don't have to pull it out of sleep. I can just grab that stylus and start writing. I can do that and still have over half of the battery left at the end of the week. That's how good the battery life is. Try the same thing on an Apple iPad, and that thing's going to drain in 1 or a little over 1 day. Night and day. Now, yeah, maybe with the Apple iPad I can put it to sleep and that will preserve battery life, but then every time I want to take a note or look at a note, I would have to, click on the button to power it up, unlock it, etc. So a huge advantage for e-ink devices. They sip battery and they're available when you need them without having to unlock the device. Huge advantage for e-ink devices. Generally speaking, e-ink devices have better price points. Now, we talked about this in the intro. This particular model of iPad is very competitive against most e-ink devices, except for the Boox 10.3, which sells at a cheaper price. But if you do any additions to the iPad at all, the base model or moving to the iPad Air, then suddenly there's a huge cost advantage, even for the more expensive of the e-ink devices. So generally speaking, from a price perspective, e-ink devices are a little bit cheaper and have an advantage there. Again, unless you're talking about the very base model of the iPad. A third thing I'll point to is that there's better tools that are available, more focused note-taking tools in some of these e-ink devices than you'll see in that native iPad's Notes app. So if you focus on two of the more developed companies, Boox and Supernote, with their note-taking apps, you see a lot of features like, for example, it's easier to get to your eraser and to continue writing, so you get more into the flow. You've got more reference functions. Supernote, for example, has headers, which are really powerful. Both Boox and Supernote have tags or keywords that allow you not to tag just the entire notebook, but you can tag whatever you want. It could be a symbol, it could be a word, it could be a line, a paragraph, and then you can refer to those and search those between notebooks. So a lot more powerful and useful tools around note-taking. As good as the iPad is, the best of these e-ink devices have native apps that are much more focused on the note-taking experience and are just frankly the right tool for the job in many cases. The fourth thing I'll point to is that the iPad requires backlighting in order for the screen to light up. And you can adjust that. You can make it dimmer or brighter. And that helps. Or going into dark mode, I think, sometimes helps. But regardless of how you set up your iPad, the e-ink devices are much easier on the eyes. Even if you're engaging front lighting, which is lighting that basically is around the side of the device and kind of lights up the screen, that's an indirect light that is much gentler than the harshness you get from an iPad screen. In fact, a reason why a lot of people go to e-ink devices is how comfortable the screen is. And people sometimes have eye strain issues, and e-ink is good for that. I don't have eye strain issues, but I really still enjoy working on e-ink devices because it's just much more of a natural surface, and it's not like looking at a screen, which I otherwise do all day long. So, I mean, it's like paper in that sense. The last thing I'll say is that the e-ink devices are a specialized device. They're built predominantly either around reading or writing, and they excel at those aspects of it. It's the opposite of the iPad. It's not one device to rule them all. It's one device with a very narrow focus. but that focus is the area where it excels at, and that includes note-taking. So as I mentioned before, as good as the iPad Notes is, and there's a lot of things to say in its favor, the specialized way that many of these e-ink companies take on note-taking just makes it a much more engaging and pleasant experience to take and refer to your notes at a later date. So given the top 5 reasons for each device, for the iPad and for e-ink, I thought I would throw out some other kind of random thoughts before I kind of give you my overall impression on where the two devices stand. Some of these are pro iPad, some of these are pro e-ink. These are just kind of general thoughts I thought were worth sharing and worth considering. The first thing is that both the iPad and some e-ink devices have screens that give a little bit. So as you put more pressure on a stylus, the screen actually bends. And this can, in some cases, give you a sense of writing on a pad of paper. I don't find it to be a particularly notable effect, but that's available on both devices. It's on e-ink if you're working with a Mobius screen, otherwise you're writing on a hard surface. But usually in those cases, when you have an e-ink device with a hard surface, they'll put on a film which will add scratchiness, and that actually, I think, gives more of a paper sense because you hear this really distinct audio feedback. So that's just something worth mentioning. Both the iPad and e-ink devices tend to have really excellent palm rejection. So you don't have a problem on any of those devices just putting your hand right against the screen and writing comfortably. It's something you just generally don't have to worry about on either e-ink or on the iPad. I noted this kind of as we went over the notes on the iPad, but they do have that continuous scrolling, so it's one long note, where e-ink devices tend to have pages. I personally like pages better, and that's important, for example, when you're searching for tags that you can identify on e-ink devices. You can go right to that page and you can see what was the thing that you were trying to highlight and refer to later. So I just think pages are a little bit better, but that's just my personal preference. E-ink does have better templates though. So we saw with the iPad that it only had a very small, limited sense of templates. E-ink devices can have 20, 30, 50, or even more templates available, and the ability in many cases to bring in your own templates. That's one huge advantage for e-ink. Another advantage for e-ink is it has this concept of layers. So a template is kind of like a layer, but it's a little specialized in the sense that you don't actually interact with the template itself. You write on top of it. Well, on the Apple Notes device, you only have that one layer to write on top of the template, where on an e-ink device, you have multiple layers. Now, generally speaking, for note-taking, you don't necessarily need to use multiple layers, but there are certain cases, like if you want to create a hand-drawn template, you can create that on a layer and then write on the layer above it. Or if you're sketching, that's another area where layers are kind of helpful because it allows you to engage certain layers without touching others. So that's just something to know. Both devices have text input, where you can use an on-screen keyboard, or in some cases even an attached keyboard or a Bluetooth keyboard to be able to type into notes. I think Apple does this way better though. They actually have word processing elements incorporated where it'll do a little bit of autocorrect, for example, as you're typing. And I just think Apple handles that typing experience better in general. Whereas with e-ink, I think e-ink handles the stylus input better, generally speaking. So those are just some general thoughts that I wanted to kind of share. So having gone over all of this, where do I stand on the thoughts of which is the better note taker, an iPad or an e-ink device? And, I've done a very tight, believe it or not, summarized version of the differences here. I mean, we could have done top 25 reasons why Apple Notes is better, and then another top 25 reasons why e-ink is better. Of course, those reasons would have been more watered down as we made the list bigger, but they would have been relevant and possibly more relevant to you. And that's one thing to keep in mind is that, a use case may, have a heavy role here. So for example, if you're in an office where everyone's using Apple products and you're doing notes, it makes a lot of sense to use an iPad because you're already kind of integrated with your system. But having said that, I personally feel like e-ink devices are still the better device for note-taking. And it's really for the reasons I kind of highlighted on number 5 for both the iPad as well as e-ink devices. iPad is great if you're just looking for that one device that does everything. It does everything well. It's kind of like a Swiss Army knife, but I would argue, even better in terms of the quality of the different features that the iPad offers. But still, it's still a general tool. And e-ink is a much more specialized tool. And if you go to look at the features that are available on a device like the Supernote or the AI paper from Viwoods or from the many Boox devices that are floating out there, there's just a ton of features available and a focus on note-taking that I think just isn't there with the Apple iPad, as good as the Apple iPad Notes app is. I just think the e-ink provides that more specialized tool that if you were willing to buy a second device, if you're okay with charging 2 devices, then it makes sense, to have this specialized note-taking device, even if you have an iPad for other purposes. That's my 2 cents on it. There is no way that I would use an iPad in lieu of my e-ink device, mainly because it's a much more pleasant writing experience on e-ink because of those battery life issues and those focus tools. I think those are the reasons why I focus on e-ink and then I enjoy it so much. And an iPad just doesn't compete ultimately, against those bonuses that e-ink offers. And then of course on top of all that, you have this really nice screen to interact with that creates no eye strain or glare. To me, it's an easy choice. But I certainly understand why some people say, well, I just want to buy one device, and the Apple Notes is a good Notes app. I mean, I don't have really anything negative to say about it. I just don't think it's as focused or has quite the utility, as impressive as it is, than some of the better e-ink note-taking devices. So that's my 2 cents on the matter. Of course, that's just my opinion. Your mileage may vary, particularly as it relates to your use case and your situation in general, but that's certainly where I stand on the matter. So it doesn't matter that we've got new iPads out. I still think that e-ink reigns supreme as it comes to reading and for note-taking. All right, I hope this was helpful. Any questions, pop those in the comments. I'll try to answer those as best I can. And until then, I hope you have a great day.